Welcome back to Illuminating the Unseen. Today we are continuing our series on Black and Indigenous people at the Old North Church during the British colonial period. I am Jaimie Crumley, the Research Fellow at the Old North Foundation. Today we will use primary source materials to learn more about slavery in Boston during the British colonial period. We will also discuss how members of the Old North Church participated in slavery. Historians such as Ira Berlin have argued that chattel slavery developed differently in different parts of the Atlantic world. Historians often classify the Caribbean and the plantation South as slave societies. Meanwhile, they describe urban areas and New England as societies with slaves. The difference between these categories is fairly straightforward. In slave societies, goods were produced primarily because of enslaved people's labor. However, in societies with slaves, enslaved laborers did not produce most of the goods. I think these categories are a bit misleading. Indeed, slavery developed differently in urban spaces than it did in rural areas. In most parts of Massachusetts, enslaved people complemented household labor. However, in the 18th century, Great Britain and all the colonies depended upon goods produced by enslaved laborers. Plantation labor mostly happened outside of New England. However, New England could not have grown as much as it did in the 18th century without embracing many of the practices of so-called slave societies. Archival materials reveal that Bostonians actively participated in slavery and the transatlantic slave trade during the British colonial period and beyond. White Bostonians enslaved people locally in New England. However, they also owned plantations in other parts of the Atlantic world. They continued to profit from slavery even after slavery was abolished in Massachusetts in 1783. You will see images of primary sources on the screen during this video. I found some of these sources at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I found the others at ancestrylibrary.com. These images will be available for you to view later on our website. The document you will see in a moment shares the numbers of enslaved people aged 16 and older who lived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony at the end of 1754 and the beginning of 1755. The numbers are based on what assessors found when they visited several Massachusetts towns. Before we look at the data, we should note that these numbers are not necessarily precise. For example, there is no data for some of the towns. The lack of data should not lead us to conclude that those towns had no enslaved people. Rather, the lack of data means that the records were lost, the data did not arrive before this report was compiled, or the assessors failed to send the data. This report helpfully shares statistics about the gender of enslaved people. However, it does not report on enslaved people who are below the age of 16. Despite its shortcomings, this report is helpful because it gives us a rough idea of how many enslaved people lived in 1750s Massachusetts. The report reveals that in early 1755, there were 989 enslaved people in Boston. 647 were male and 342 were female. Let's look at some of the numbers in other parts of the state to give us an idea of how prevalent slavery was in colonial Massachusetts. In Salem, there were 83 enslaved people. 47 were men and 36 were women. Cambridge contained 56 enslaved people. 33 were male and 23 were female. These numbers reveal that it was almost universal for elite white people to be enslavers in colonial Massachusetts. A review of the Old North Church's baptism records reveal that during the mid-18th century, Alexander Chamberlain, John Gould, John Greeton, Jacob Royal, Mary Gibbs, George Skinner, among others, had their enslaved people, infants, children, and adults, baptized at this church. The 1755 report helps us to see that white New Englanders held enslaved people in their New England homes. However, we have to look beyond the number of enslaved people in New England to see just how actively New Englanders, including white Old North members, participated in slavery. I learned the story of how one Old North member was connected to slavery in the West Indies through a 1925 Boston Daily Globe article about a mysterious portrait. I understand that a 1925 newspaper article is a circuitous route to finding an 18th century Old North parishioner, but things will make sense in a minute. Bear with me. The 1925 newspaper article introduces us to Charles K. Bolton's wife. Charles Bolton was an early 20th century warden of the Old North Church. He also served as the librarian at the Boston Athenaeum, which is one of my favorite places in Boston, from 1898 to 1933. In 1925, his wife Ethel discovered a 175-year-old portrait of an unidentified early aristocratic resident of Salem Street. The Boston Daily Globe article is about Ethel Bolton's failed efforts to identify the man in the picture. In the background of the portrait, she saw the Old North Church. She also saw an old Puritan house that sat on the north side of North Bennett and Salem Streets. The house was built in the early 18th century. And here's where the story reconnects to Old North's 18th century history. From 1772 until 1781, Francis Craquet owned that home. Craquet was a prosperous merchant who was based in the West Indies. In April of 1771, he was the proprietor of Pew 42 at the Old North Church. Tax records from 1776 to 1781 show that Craquet owned over 40 enslaved people on his plantation in St. Croix. They ranged in age from infants to adult men and women. After the American Revolution, Francis, Elizabeth, and Charlotte Craquet still held enslaved people in St. Croix. The Craquet family is one of many 18th century Old North families who demonstrate that Old North's history takes us far beyond Boston's North End. The Old North Church's earliest parishioners belonged to an Atlantic world network that stretched far beyond Salem Street. The challenge for us as we encounter wealthy white merchants like Francis Craquet and their enslaved people like Ebo Jack, Rosette, and Present in archival documents is how we can get to know them beyond rigid documents like tax records and vestry reports. In a sense, despite the additional knowledge we have gained about Old North's connection to slavery, we remain like Ethel Bolton and her mysterious portrait. We are holding on to a series of clues that do not tell a complete story. 18th century Old North parishioners remind us that slavery in Massachusetts was simultaneously a local and global crisis. Accessing these records can help us to be more conscious of how the small, everyday decisions we make in our communities have implications that reverberate far beyond us. Do you want to know more about the history of slavery in Massachusetts? If so, please consult the resource list on the website. I will share more of my findings about Black slavery and freedom at Old North as my research continues to unfold. Please be in touch with your thoughts and questions about this video. You can leave your comments and questions below the video or contact me directly.